Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And visit patreon.com/vmspod or paypal.me/vmspod to make a one-time or recurring donation and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. Well, last episode I said something like, of course, if the COVID-19 situation takes a major turn for the worse, the question of what I'll do with my podcast is really kind of minuscule. Obviously, it got worse. I posted a bonus mini episode earlier tonight that goes into the changes the show will have to make in terms of recording remotely with guests instead of in person and other stuff. I also talk about some of the anxiety I'm going through, so that's loads of fun. But rather than rehash all that, let's just get to the new episode. My guest this week is Sato Moughalian, author of the wonderful new book, Feast of Ashes, The Life and Art of David Ohanessian, from Stanford University Press's Redwood Press imprint. Her book is about her grandfather, David Ohanessian, a famed ceramicist, but it's about a lot more. She explores the history of her family in rural Anatolia in the Ottoman Empire and the trauma of the Armenian genocide, the weird good fortune that allowed her grandfather to build a ceramic arts factory in Jerusalem, the bad fortune, as in like world historical bad fortune, that seemed to follow her family until her parents managed to emigrate to New Jersey. And there's more, including a deep family secret. I tell you what it is, but we decided during the episode to keep it secret just to give you one more reason to buy Feast of Ashes. It's really an amazing piece of historical study, weaving her family's history in with the major movements of the 20th century in Turkey and the Middle East as the great powers are fading. And it shows not just the beauty of the ceramic tile art her grandfather and his associates created, but it also goes into like the challenges of building a business around it. There are passages in there that are just about how do you get this business off the ground of making these absolutely gorgeous tiles, ones that like they want you to retile the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, but you have to get your staff up and going. You've got to get the right clay. You've got all this other stuff to manage. It goes into a lot of different things. It's a beautiful, beautiful book, though. I found it absolutely amazing. Plus, in the coda, Sato writes about her experiences and her angst in going to Turkey, Anatolia, the former Ottoman Empire, to research the book, given that it's the root of all of this horrendous trauma her family went through. And as you longtime listeners know, I'm a sucker for intergenerational trauma. So, Feast of Ashes, remarkable work. I'm so happy. My past guest, Jonathan Hyman, suggested I connect with Sato to do a show. I should point out, this is the last in-person episode I recorded. There are 3 more that I recorded earlier in that week, but this just happens to be the last one I've sat down with somebody in person for. I have no idea when there'll be another one. So, one of the nice things, Sato had a number of her grandfather's pieces in her apartment, and there are images of that on the show notes page for this episode. So I got to check those out when I visited. My one big regret, Sato is this accomplished and amazing flutist, and I didn't think to ask her to play a little on mic for me. I don't know if that would have been insulting to ask her to do that, but I didn't even think of it because I'm a dummy. As caveats go, There is some New York City construction and traffic noise. We recorded just above the George Washington Bridge, and there was construction right around the corner, but that evened out over time. Unfortunately, during the episode, we talk about some of her scheduled lectures coming up, including ones that would have been this week. Everything has been canceled and postponed, obviously, with COVID-19. I decided to leave those parts in because they're interesting, and maybe also because they show how quickly everything has changed. And maybe years from now, we'll listen back at some of these and remember what it was like. Also, near the end, I might sort of sound like I'm trying to justify the behavior of the Turks, especially against the Kurds, by citing the awful behavior of other European countries. That is not exactly what I was trying to get at. That said, it is important to be aware of history and not just pick and choose whose atrocities count and whose don't. But before I dig myself another hole, let's get Sato's bio from the flap copy of Feast of Ashes. Sato Moughalian is an award-winning flutist in New York City and artistic director of Perspectives Ensemble, founded in 1993 to explore and contextualize work of composers and visual artists. Since 2007, Ms. Moughalian has also traveled to Turkey, England, Israel, Palestine, and France to uncover the traces of her grandfather's life and work. She's published articles and gives talks on the genesis of Jerusalem's Armenian ceramic art. Her new book is Feast of Ashes. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Sato Moughalian. So I know it's in the introduction, but tell me about the origins of the book.
I grew up an immigrant child in New Jersey, and I was regaled with stories of my ancestors from a very young age. And of course, I grew up seeing the beautiful artwork that my grandfather had created. He was a well-known ceramicist who founded an art in Jerusalem that's extremely popular today and very much identified with the city. As I went through college and the following years and developed a greater interest in him, started trying to learn more about the specifics and see what had been written about him, I saw that there were giant gaps and errors in everything that had been written about him. He was included in art historical surveys, but always with major mistakes. And because I'm a musician and because I'm particularly interested in how music and how art relate to the environments in which they're created, I got gripped by the idea of doing some research and finding out more about who my grandfather was and what the specifics were of his journey from Kütahya, this place, a ceramic center in the Ottoman Empire where he had mastered the art before the First World War, to Jerusalem, where he founded this art that's so popular today. It was a 10 or 15-year journey of sitting in libraries, of early morning emails to auction house curators, museum curators, people who had written about him, and then digging into my family's attics and garages for any remaining documentary material. And that was really the origin of the book. It was the sort of a quest on my part to see where this ancestor, whom I never met because he died before I was born, where he was from, how he was formed, and I thought in the process I might learn something about myself.
Did you appreciate the ceramics when you were young? Did you get it? I only ask because I've always been left cold by decorative arts. Except for this, I'm gesturing to some of the work that's there. Like I've been in the Netherlands, and they have the little the cookware, things like that. It's just meh. But something like this, it just has, maybe it's the Semitic roots that I have. The work that your grandfather did jumps out at me, or it has much more resonance, I guess. Did it matter to you?
I loved it from the beginning.
Yeah.
I loved it from the beginning, but I don't know if it's whether I loved it or it formed my aesthetic taste, because from, as far back as I can remember, I was looking at this intensely saturated colored glaze, with the brilliant finish and these patterns that seemed so ancient, but were so intense at the same time. So I think it really formed my aesthetic sense. And then as I got to know about him as a professional, I think it gave me a kind of confidence that one could actually go into the arts and make one's way there.
What was your biggest surprise when you were doing the research?
My biggest surprise was how much material there really was in the archives, how much there really was remaining that had been untouched, in spite of the amount that had been written about this Jerusalem art.
Mm-hmm. Had you done any sort of academic writing or research like this before?
Yes. In my work as a musician, I founded a group in 1993 at Columbia University called Perspectives Ensemble. And what we do is we present works of music contextualized by both the time and place in which they were written, but also the influences that were operating on the composers at the time of composition. And in the beginning, we programmed kind of thematic concerts, in the way that's popular now and has been for the last 20 years. And I did research and writing. And then over the years, I've tried to actually integrate that research into our performances. But all this time I've been writing essays and also writing for myself, writing for the benefit of musicians, and doing research.
Yeah. Even with your grandfather, you mentioned, 3,500 words is one thing, but, a full-length book.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as I said, I was kind of casually researching his life. I mean, I started out by reading everything that had been written about him, everything I could find, and then everything sort of in the tangential areas, this late Ottoman ceramics, and then ceramics during the British Mandate of Palestine. And in 2013, a great Armenian art historian, Dikran Kumjan, asked me to contribute a biographical essay to a collection. And so I kind of dropped everything, went to Jerusalem, did some more research, wrote the essay, and then it was sent to be reviewed by a couple of readers, and one of them turned out to be the great John Carswell, who's, the best known and most rigorous, I guess, scholar of Kütahya ceramics, who wrote this monumental book cataloging the Kütahya ceramics in the Cathedral of St. James in Jerusalem. So unbeknownst to me, he read my biographical essay and suggested to Dikran that maybe I should try to write a book, which seemed like an utter impossibility to me. And then a series of, happy doors opened. I was able to audit Samuel Friedman's famous book seminar at Columbia Journalism School. And then a good friend of mine who was an editor, someone I respect very, very much, said, you can absolutely do this. So I thought, all right, I'm going to give it a try.
Do you add historian to your CV now, or biographer?
No, I don't say, I'm still the same person. Yeah. I'm a musician who's like obsessed by cultural history and environment and filling in gaps. And so that's what I set out to do. I set out to fill in the gaps in his life. So some of the gaps were for obvious reasons, political reasons. There's obviously a lot that's been written about Kütahya ceramics by European art historians and Turkish art historians. And, even in that writing, there's mention of my grandfather and mention that he ended up in Jerusalem. And then, of course, there are British art historians and Israeli art historians who've written about Jerusalem ceramics. But there was always this hole in between the two.
It's like the reverse Venn diagram.
Yeah, exactly. How did this art move from one place to the other? And of course, I knew as his granddaughter that the answer to that question was tied to his arrest and deportation during the Armenian genocide. But, either because the art historians didn't really have access to the information or because they didn't sort of want to touch the subject, it remained a gap. So it was that gap that I needed to fill. And at the same time, I had another desire, which was that in my family, as in many families, oral storytelling was the way history was passed down from one generation to the next. And I'm probably separated from illiteracy by only 4 generations. My grandfather was born in a really isolated mountain village in western Anatolia, and the history of his people, his clan, so to speak, his Gerdastan, as we say in Armenian, the extended family, was passed down from generation to generation by oral storytelling. And I think when this goes on for that long, families develop a style, a language, an approach to encapsulating these pieces of information and passing them down in a way that can be retained and respoken. So my grandfather had told those stories to his children, my mother being among them, and my mother told them to my brother and me. And we had been uprooted so many times. I mean, he and my grandmother in the deportations around the Armenian genocide. My mother, who was born in Palestine, was herself uprooted in 1947 by the violence in her neighborhood. She bounced around the Middle East, ended up in Egypt in the time of Gamal Abdel Nasser, where there's, again, violence.
There was a black cloud aspect to it. It's like, wow, and Beirut next?
Yeah. It was like, Egypt, Damascus. Yeah. So then I was born, and things were getting worse. So
New Jersey?
They left, ended up in New Jersey in the sort of idyllic small town of Highland Park, where I grew up. And, I thought at a certain point that, I wanted to make sure that these stories survived. My mother, before she died, transcribed about 50 pages of family stories, inherited family stories. But part of what I wanted to do in this book was to keep a sense of the language that she used, a sense of the storytelling. So even though there's a lot of original research in the book and several hundred endnotes, some of which connect to documents in Ottoman Turkish from the Ottoman archives, I still wanted to keep that sense of a story being told out loud.
And you do that very well with balancing that against the historical fact, the cultural moment, not the family's moment also, which is a difficult balancing act on the one side, but also one that's fraught with choices. As you said, the historians may have avoided discussing the Armenian genocide, presumably because they're coming from a certain perspective or don't want to offend one group or another.
Yeah, or we're just not familiar with the circumstances and certainly not familiar with the circumstances of my grandfather's deportation. I mean, historians always make choices. It's not only biographers or memoirists who make those choices, but historians make choices too, because every work that involves history is an argument that's made by the writer. So, you choose one thing and not the other. So I, of course, did that as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's a story I've told on the podcast in the past, but my town was founded in 1742, the town I live in New Jersey. And the town handbook that I had when I was a little kid explained that it was a hunting ground for the Lenni Lenape Indians. But with the arrival of the European settlers, the Indian way of life had to come to an end.
It was a hunting ground of the Lenni Lenape.
Yeah, ultimately, yeah.
Native Americans.
They didn't live there, but yes, the Indian way of life had to come to an end was how it was framed when I was a child. So yeah, there's always, a way of trying to make things seemingly innocuous, and that's when he ended up in Jerusalem instead of
right, exactly.
Yeah,
I mean, in fact, the story was sort of well worn into a series of grooves that went something like this: the British invited 3 families from Kütahya to come to Jerusalem to retile the Dome of the Rock. So that's how it was handed down until I started doing this research, and I realized that that wasn't true at all. The British didn't even, with the exception of one person, the British didn't even know that Kütahya was a ceramic center. So, so it was, a lot of sort of unpeeling that I had to do and documenting, going back to the sources that the art historians had relied upon, reading them a little more carefully, a little more critically, and finding that they actually contained more information than had been mined.
But again, they may not have been thinking of even looking for it. Were there family myths that also turned out not to be true?
Not really.
Okay.
There weren't really family myths, but there were really traumatic events in our family that
weren't discussed.
that formed a series of silences.
I don't know if we want to mention them, given the spoiler aspect of things, but there's a key thing that happens that
I didn't know until about 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah, it was a family secret, or not even something that was a secret from the family. In some respects. But again, that's something for the readers to discover, because it makes the book just heartrending when you get to this segment. It's just an amazing piece of work. Was there a missing piece of research or missing thing you wish you could have found?
There are still some sites that were recorded by my aunt in the last year of her father's life that I have not been able to find. So at some point late in the process, I was really trying to hunt down like all his monumental tile works, and there are a few that I just could not find. I listed them in, there are several appendices, but there's one that pertains to his work made in Kütahya and one that pertains to his work made in Jerusalem, and there are some question marks in there. And I'm hoping that other people, maybe some art historians, some PhD students or whatever, pick up the story of Kütahya ceramics, because there's still so much to be discovered.
New info since you finished the book?
Not really.
Okay. I'm glad that sometimes there's we found something, or somebody read it and said, oh, my father's got all these tiles and we know exactly where this was. So I'm sure it'll take time as the book proliferates. But what's the public response?
It's been great. And I've been going around doing a lot of talks at universities. I've actually been thrilled at the reception there. Middle East Studies departments, Armenian Studies, Art History. I recently did a talk in California that was co-sponsored by the Art History Department and the Human Rights Studies Department at UC Davis. And so, of course, for people who are from Jerusalem or feel a close connection to Jerusalem or who have a particular love for this art, they've really taken the book to heart.
Yeah, I noticed Adina Hoffman, who I have recently connected to through a weird Yale thing. I do not have an Ivy League education of my own. But I'm supposed to record with her sometime this year. Then I saw her blurbing this. I'm like, oh, good. All my various guests all tie together for me. This is fantastic.
Well, we met, I think it was in 2011, or we were connected anyway, because my aunt, by marriage, had become the director of New Directions Publications. I mean, she worked there for 30 years, but...
what was her name?
Griselda Ohanessian.
Oh.
And when she died, the person who had taken her place sent a message through the family that there was this writer who was putting together a book on architecture in Mandate Jerusalem, and that they had just been talking about Armenian ceramics and David Ohanessian, and could I be connected with Adina? And so I met her then, and she interviewed me, and we sort of stayed in touch as we were both researching and making discoveries about Ohanessian's work. And then she did actually write a substantial a portrait of Ohanessian in her next to last book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm supposed to talk to her about the Ben Hecht book, where I was assuming Ohanessian was not going to show up.
No.
But, there's always a possibility. Again, everything ties together.
It was in the previous book, yeah.
But tell me about the lectures. You have one coming up well, you have several coming up in March and April,
yes.
but, a significant one coming up in mid-March.
I do. I have the great honor of being invited to give the Dr. Berj Haidostyan annual lecture at the University of Michigan, the Armenian Studies Center, in the middle of March. And in spite of coronavirus, I'm going. I hope some people will show up. I'm speaking at Brandeis on 2 days before the Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day. And I have several other university talks. I mean, again, in one school I was invited by an Ottoman historian. I'm going to speak at Columbia soon in a class on urban landscape and Middle East conflict. I'm going to give a session on Jerusalem in the years immediately after the First World War and how Armenian ceramics sort of integrated themselves into that urban landscape. So it's been quite a varied series of things, which I'm enjoying very, very much.
How different is it from touring with music? Or you're integrating music into it and it kind of feels like it's all the same?
Well, sometimes I do integrate music into the talks themselves. I might start with a short musical segment. In the case of Michigan, I'm giving a full concert two nights after. It's quite demanding to combine the two things because each one is demanding on its own, but to do them together is extremely demanding. So I kind of prefer to do one at a time, but if they invite me, I'll come.
You can't turn down a gig. That was Joan Rivers' big lesson. If there's empty boxes in the calendar, somebody else is filling them up. That's
Well, I mean, the thing is, I wrote this book. I spent the decade or more doing the research because I wanted to tell a story that had not been told. And also, I mean, it wasn't like just a story and it wasn't just a gap, but it's really a remarkable life. And I felt that, apart from the fact that he was my grandfather, just from what he survived and what he accomplished, his resilience, his imagination, his creativity, the way he was able to integrate like the sort of business sense together with the artistic sense, to do these monumental installations, to participate in a revivalist period of architecture in the Ottoman Empire during those few optimistic years before the First World War. Like all of that, I thought was a story that deserved to be told. And
I thought you do a great job, particularly with the business aspect of it. Showing that this wasn't just, hey, we'll make some tiles. It really gets into what it means to try to do this as a business, what it means to source the clay from Anatolia and all this, and try to make things work. Even the metallurgy aspect of it. There's a really comprehensive way of telling the story that isn't simply, an artist making art, but everything that goes into what it means to do it for a living. I guess.
Well, also because that's such a remarkable part of the story that here is this person, whose family had lived in northwest Anatolia for centuries, who came from a family that, he was partly descended from other ceramicists and who learned this extremely localized art. I mean, this art grew out of the clays and minerals that were available in that region, and this art that we know very well, this Iznik art and the Kütahya art, I mean, the colors are, of course, directly linked to the minerals that were available there. Kütahya was on a kind of ancient trade route, so, you had fabrics coming from the Far East, and you had ceramics coming from the Far East, and then going to the Far East. So you had this exchange of visual repertoire of colors based on the materials that were there. So it was like a very well-defined art form, and he was displaced, ended up in Palestine where they had none of the materials that were necessary, and yet he had the possibility of this life-changing commission, which was to make renovation tiles for the Dome of the Rock, which itself, was decorated with tiles that were not necessarily in the Iznik aesthetic, but the challenge for him was to be able to make tiles that would work on this extraordinary monument in Jerusalem.
And I liked as among the various things you include visually, the planning documents, the sketches and things to show how you have to figure this stuff out and put it all together. Again, it's remarkable in terms of capturing every aspect of what it meant to be able to make these things and again, run a studio and build it as an industry. Also the irony of Armenian Christian in what becomes a Jewish state doing the Dome of the Rock for the Muslim population is just, capturing everything that's, completely irreconcilable about Jerusalem, I guess.
Well, yeah. And also, when we look at these arts from the top down, we look at like the arts in Kütahya and Iznik. I mean, Iznik in particular, which was the primary ceramic making center in the Ottoman Empire, Kütahya was the secondary center farther away from the capital. Iznik was fulfilling all these orders for the royal court and, had a very specific way of design. And there were, designers. We think of, this is called today it's called a Turkish art, and Kütahya is called a Turkish art. I call it an Ottoman art. But we know less about who was actually making the art in Iznik, but we do know that in Kütahya over the centuries there were many Armenians, there were also Greeks, there were also Turks. So although it was made in a place that today is called Turkey, it was the collaborative effort of like so many different people from so many different backgrounds. And I think that's what's interesting about looking at it from the point of view of an individual is that you see, who this individual was, how he fit into that environment. And then in Jerusalem, again, you had the Dome of the Rock, which was covered in tiles in the mid-16th century under Suleiman the Magnificent, but it was tiled and retiled and retiled. I mean, any externally tiled monument has to be refreshed and totally renovated on a regular basis. And since they didn't have the materials that were necessary there, streams of people came from different Persia, Kütahya, probably Iznik, came there, brought materials, made tiles in whatever style they were working at that time, and then left. So it itself was this composite of the history of its own art.
But yeah, I mean, to me, it's interesting beyond, well, as you say, the fact that it wasn't art back then. There were artisans, but they weren't, there was no famous ceramist necessarily.
I'm not sure that that's entirely true. Today, what we see on the Dome of the Rock is much more uniform because it was basically detiled, according to John Carswell, deconstructed in the 1960s and then completely or almost completely retiled. But at the time of my grandfather, according to E.T. Richmond, the British consulting architect who was brought in right after the British conquered Jerusalem, he wrote a book analyzing the various periods of restoration, and there were many signed tiles.
I thought there were a bunch. Was this the one where some of them were Abdullahs, if they were Christians who were... Well,
Abdullah was the name that could be used by people of any faith. Yeah. Understood.
So is there I think you mentioned in the afterward, no significant Armenian population in Highland Park, right, when you were...
I don't think there were any other Armenians in Highland Park.
Was there an Armenian Pride idea within the family that, was there always a sense of your Armenianness?
Yes, very, very much so.
Yeah.
There was a sense of our Armenianness, but there was also a sense that, we needed to assimilate as quickly as possible. So, there was a lot of explaining what an Armenian was as I was growing up. And, we would take the bus and go to St. Vartan's Church on important holidays, particularly my mother would. But I did feel quite isolated, outside my home. I did feel quite isolated from my identity. And I think that became a really important motivation to immerse myself in history books for a period of years, to try to figure out what had happened in my own family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, how present was the genocide in your youth? I seem to recall it being mentioned as not with a euphemism, but not exactly.
Well, I mean, there's the question of the language of the genocide, which is very separate from the idea of the genocide. We didn't use the word genocide as I was growing up. And I think that that's true for a lot of Armenians, that it has sort of entered family parlance, like in recent years. My mother called it the massacres. I mean, definitely, like we heard about it on a regular basis. But it was extremely painful. And it was, as is the case with descendants of mass violence and, expulsion from place. These are sometimes traumas that take more than one generation to process. And that was definitely the case with my family. I mean, her parents and her 3 eldest siblings had been deported not once, but twice. And then she felt this huge sense of attachment to Jerusalem, to Palestine. And it was devastating for her and her siblings to have to leave, which they thought would be a temporary thing. They thought they would be able to return. And as it turned out, they were out of Jerusalem and became stateless. And, it was very, very hard for them to land anywhere where they felt secure after that.
Mm-hmm. Did you feel at home growing up?
No.
Have you ever felt at home?
I felt at home in music. I mean, I came from a family of talkers and readers. And, so I was surrounded by books. I learned to read when I was very, very young. People were always giving me books. My mother gave me books. My aunt Griselda introduced me to Nabokov's work when I was about 11 years old. And there I felt at home.
Oh, well, let me tell you, the recording with the publisher at New Directions, when we finished up, and she said, you see anything on those shelves, you can take those with you. Literally this
is Barbara?
Yeah. I'm walking out with this giant stack of books on the way, trying to figure out, my car is 4 blocks away. Can I do this without dropping everything in the time? So yes, the New Directions thing can really wallop you.
Well, I mean, it wasn't just the New Directions books. It was literature in general. I mean, a huge, huge range. And I read just voraciously. So I felt at home in books, and I felt at home producing sound, because for all the emotions that were like knotted up inside me that had no sort of clear form of expression in my childhood years, other than acting out and getting into, arguments with my mother, the act of practicing the recorder, the piano, the flute, the kind of repetition, the wordlessness of it, the fact that nobody said, "Oh, be less expressive." I mean, there was no shutting me up, in that medium. I was encouraged to express myself, and I found, as I became more adept in music, that it was this enormous sense of release and relief. I did have some very, very rocky times, and I did go through a period of 7 years of intense, I don't want to call it analysis, I'll call it therapy, where I experimented with different forms of therapy, including EMDR and other therapies that are used for people with sort of post-traumatic manifestations. But that wasn't enough for me. I had to kind of immerse myself in psychoanalytic reading. So I started reading about family systems theory, and then British object relations, school, and then intergenerational transmission of trauma. So it was a 7-year, pretty dark period of just looking for a way to recontextualize my own inner world, which was very rocky and self-destructive. And that was an extremely fertile period in my life. And at the end of those 7 years, when I recognized that, I was actually performing a work of grief on behalf of my family, I realized that grief and trauma were not the only things that I had inherited. I had also inherited a passion for beauty, a passion to make things, to make order out of chaos. And toward the very end of this, I also recognized that, these urges were just as much a part of my inheritance. And that was a great motivation in wanting to learn more about my grandfather and to feel a deeper sense of connection with him, because he had lived through so much. And through it all, he was trying to create, like under the most dire circumstances, he was trying to create. And so it was actually a bleak but beautiful period of my life in which, at the end of it, it just unleashed so much energy, this sort of 7-year period of introspection and grief work.
Your parents weren't happy with music, right?
No, they were not happy at all.
I don't know if that ties into everything you just talked about, but yeah, I can imagine you can't be a doctor or an engineer.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, they got over it eventually. Yeah, they didn't have a choice. They came around.
Got to see you successful as a.
They did. They got to see me, established in a life that I loved.
Mm-hmm. Are either of them still alive?
Unfortunately not. My mother died in 1995. My father died in 2007. So they didn't get to see this. And there's only one member of their generation still alive who was married to my mother's sister, my uncle, who himself is an artist. He's 95 years old, and he makes art every day. He was an architect by profession, and he was with my grandfather when my grandfather took his last breath. So I'm really grateful that this uncle of mine is alive in Newton, Massachusetts, and that, I've had the opportunity to tell a bit of his story in the book, but also just for him to see the book come to fruition.
Mm-hmm. And the rest of the family?
They're thrilled.
Okay.
They're thrilled. Most of them have read the book. Some of them have not read the book. I mean, we're all kind of dealing with our own histories in our own way and at our own pace. And, this legacy of trauma has come down in different ways. People have varying modes of resilience. Some of them had more resilience than I did. And others are just taking their time because there's no reason to rush through it. It's a book. Yeah. It's not going anywhere now.
I'm the only guy who has to. I've got to read this before we get together. 'Cause God forbid I record with a guest and haven't actually read their book, which apparently, the authors I record with are like, do you understand how rare that is? Most of them never read anything. And they just show up with a bunch of questions.
Yeah.
And so I feel a little better about myself.
You're very well prepared.
I try, Tell me about New York, about your New York.
I love New York.
I recorded with Milton Glaser last year. He designed the I Love New York logo. But
I know. He's my hero.
Yeah.
He's the hero to many of us. Well, in many ways, it's like another country in the United States. I mean, more than 40% of the people who live in New York City were born in another country, which makes it very energetic, very striving, very diverse, very rich. There's everything here. I can travel to China and discover some, dynasty of porcelain work and then come back here and there's a museum devoted to it or a gallery devoted to it. There are these incredible universities. We have incredible libraries, which are open to everyone. It's a very generous city, I think. And from as far back as I can remember, I wanted to live here. The thing I love about my life as a musician here is, I freelance, I play with orchestras, I play shows, I play a lot of contemporary music. I've been doing projects for many, many years, and I work with other people who do their own projects. So they participate in my projects, I participate in their projects, and so there's this kind of rich, fluid community of creative people who are supporting each other, and it's wonderful.
Mm-hmm. How's the city changed for you? I know there's the obvious, all the money comes rolling in. It's unaffordable further south in Manhattan, but Has the city...
Even up here, it's quite unaffordable.
Yeah, I had to park a few blocks from here. I took a nice walk down and thought, these are some very, very nice apartments. And yeah, I've always lived... I live in the house I grew up in, which is 25 miles from here in the northern New Jersey. And we have this one road. There are two roads out of my town, which gives you an idea of the isolation. Yeah. One is called Skyline Drive, and I can see your house from there. When you go over, and you can see the entire spread almost to the southern tip of the island.
How wonderful.
For about 5 to 6 seconds, depending on how you're driving over the top. But I've always had New York in the distance. I know I can come here, and I can leave and get back to the woods where I'm living. But it's, it's gotten different. It's gotten a little New Jersey-like, down in well, the further south you get, the sense of, trying to mallify everything for tourists.
Yeah, neonify things for tourists. I mean, I remember the first time I went to the Triangle at the Louvre. I went to the underground level and found, the body shop. And I thought, I mean, how many times have I traveled to a city or going in the Forbidden City? I mean, a while back in China, you would go into the Forbidden City, you go through the whole thing. And at the end, there was a Starbucks, which thankfully they've removed. But, we would have to have a whole other podcast, I think, to talk about the commercialization, the corporatization, all of that. But there's still enough grit and striving and newcomers here to have a really just fertile environment for creative work. I mean, there is more money, and some of the money has found its way into the arts, which is good. And I think also just by virtue of the fact that, so many more schools have conservatories and those people graduate and then come to New York, that the pool is very, very large of, striving creative people who are here. So, I mean, that's really enriched the city. And of course, the housing situation is not friendly, but it doesn't stop people from trying.
Oh, yeah. I was recording this morning in a cartoonist studio in Gowanus, where they pack about 15 or 16 cartoonists into a little tiny L-shaped area. And this one writer who I was recording with, she has a little desk there. By little, I mean half the size of the table we're sitting at, and that's her little space to work in when she gets out of the apartment. So
yeah,
people make do. There's always a way of doing this. But how is your music career, or how has the field sort of changed over the time you've been in it?
Well,
again, the performing, I don't know if that's separate from recording. I don't know how you segment.
Okay, there's a lot less commercial recording work in New York City because of the development of the internet and all that, and the fact that people can now record remotely in Sofia, Bulgaria, or other places while sitting in a control booth in Chicago. So, you can score a film remotely now. And so that's changed. But on the other hand, there's a lot more activity of newly written music. I mean, Lincoln Center, for example, leans toward bigger, more monumental productions, the White Lights Festival. I mean, there are all these new festivals, which is great. But they tend toward huge productions, and sometimes because they tend toward huge productions, they want productions that have been proven in other countries. And so, huge funding goes to that. I mean, we have the Shed now. We have yet to see how that's going to work out. But we have these incredible new venues, the Armory on 67th. I mean, that's not a new venue, but it's a venue that's developed over time, and it's an amazing venue. At the same time, there's National Sawdust, and there are all these much smaller places that have popped up very successfully. And I think, there's an audience for music as a religious activity where, you're all sitting amongst hundreds or thousands of people looking up to the high priest on the stage, who's performing the concerto, which, you must listen to 3 movements or 4 movements without applauding. I mean, I consider that sort of after the religious model. And then there's the intimate model where, you take several subways to Brooklyn and you're in a tiny space right around the musicians hearing the very first performance of a piece, which is a really exciting thing to do, both as a performer and in the audience. So both ends, both extremes of the performing and attending experience, I think, have multiplied over the last 20 years or so. And it's, as New York has been for so long, it's a, top international travel destination for exactly those reasons.
Notwithstanding the financial side of it, what sort of format do you prefer playing in or performing in?
I love all of them.
I figured it's not going to be a Sophie's Choice moment here.
Every single one of them, and I'm incredibly grateful to have a platform where I can do my own, experiments in how do you integrate music with its history, on a project by project basis. And I'm incredibly grateful to have, this group of extraordinarily accomplished musicians who throw themselves into these projects and bring them to life.
Do the sorts of audiences seem more knowledgeable and appreciative of this stuff, or this stuff, which sounds incredibly derogatory, of this sort of work? Or has it changed, I guess, in terms of sophistication?
The world has changed. The world has changed so much. The internet has changed the world. 20 years ago, if I was preparing for a concert, I might actually go to Europe, and sometimes I would even go to Europe in search of recordings because you couldn't get them here. Now I open my computer, I go to YouTube, whatever. The world is much more at our fingertips, and that has infiltrated, I think where we once had kind of compositional stylistic periods, now we have everything all at once. It's just an incredibly fertile time, I think.
Is there a second book? Not necessarily about this, but do you have a second book?
I do have an idea for a second book, and over the next year I'm going to be creating a full evening piece from scratch with my great colleague, the Syrian Armenian American artist Kevork Murad, with whom I've worked a number of times over the years. And we're creating a piece that we're going to call Gav, which is the Armenian word for clay. And this piece, which will use both his technique of painting onto a screen that gets projected onto a large screen for the audience and morphs in and out of his own animations, integrated with live performance. The piece is going to explore this kind of universal urge that people have all over the world to take this most basic material, dirt, clay, and form it into their own ideas of beauty. So that's a huge project over the next year, which actually involves a lot of research on both our parts. But then I do have a book project that I'm going to simultaneously be researching and working on.
I only ask the next book thing as a concept. I never want authors to say, my next book is X, and then, curse my name for the rest of time when they can't,
It was such an agony to write one book. I
figured, and it's so recent, I wouldn't, so what's your next act?
But I was so fortunate. People supported my efforts. I found this wonderful editor, Kate Wall, who's editor-in-chief of Stanford University Press, who nurtured me through the whole thing, from book proposal to the book. Dan Menaker, the editor I was referring to earlier, also, read every chapter, gave me detailed critiques. I couldn't have done it without him, couldn't have done it without her, couldn't have done it without Sam Friedman. There were just so many people who were incredibly generous, and, I couldn't have done it without them. Along the way, of course, I made mistakes. I learned from the mistakes. So I'm hoping that if I do write this next book, that I will benefit from my own experience.
What sort of mistakes, if you don't mind my...
just things like not having a bibliography program.
I wondered, with the university press, was that what drove particularly the notation and
No, I was always going to have lots
sources
and lots of sources. I mean, I had to, because I didn't want to just be the granddaughter telling the story of the grandfather.
Definitely.
I wanted to have a sort of meticulous evidence.
I can back all this up.
Yeah. And although the book was published by Stanford University Press and went through the, anonymous review process, both at the beginning and at the end, they have a trade imprint called Redwood Press. And that's, the book was released under Redwood Press, but under the same standards that any book that Stanford University Press releases undergoes.
So mainly the bibliographic thing was the mistake you were, or the thing you would do better?
I mean, I made really dumb mistakes. There was no way that I could have known, for example, how to choose file names for documents that I was scanning in various archives. I think even now, I find
it's just image 001. And,
there was a lot of the image 001, or I would name a file, but then, because the content of the file covered several different subject areas, I might only remember one of them, and, then it would take forever to find it 4 years later when I needed it. So, because I didn't do a PhD, I didn't write a dissertation, I didn't take a bibliography class, which might have been helpful to me, because, there are documents scanned from the Ottoman archives that are written in Ottoman Turkish. And, there are a lot of languages. I had to use a lot of translators. I had a fantastic research assistant in Istanbul who was a PhD student at Boğaziçi University, who had spent 10 years working in the Ottoman archives, and his assistance was completely invaluable. So, but, you're left with just all these gigabytes, terabytes of files. And so I think that would be the biggest thing I would
systematize.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I've got a couple of writing programs I use where you basically use hashtags within them so that they can be cross-referenced to each other. That's one of those didn't really exist when you were starting this project. So, going back and reverse engineering that in, or retrofitting that in.
Yeah.
Wouldn't work.
Well, even in the documents that my family had preserved, they were sometimes just, paper stuffed in envelopes. Mm-hmm. And then you would discover that one of those pieces of paper was, had an address on it, or one might be a bar bill from a cafe in Paris in 1931, when my grandfather was there, with notations on the back. So there was a lot of really, really miscellaneous kind of documentation that had to be harnessed and organized.
But you even run into that moment where one of the pictures seems too thick, and then you realize it's got second picture stuck to it behind. You carefully have to peel that. And
that was amazing.
Yeah.
That was really amazing, because the truth is that auction that I mentioned, Christie's in 2008, I actually bought 2 of the tile panels. And so, I saw those tile panels. I recognized them as my grandfather's work, even though the descriptive information in the catalog seemed wrong to me. But one of them, we're looking at it right now, is identical with the tiles that we see in St. Andrew's Church, Scottish church in Jerusalem. So that was a big clue. But it wasn't until I peeled apart those 2 photographs and saw that the same 6 tile panels that were offered for sale at this Christie's auction also appeared all together in this mosque in Beirut, that I realized what the provenance of them must have actually been. And then through the magic of the internet, an acquaintance, a friend of mine, connected me to an informal historian of Beirut mosques in Beirut, a pharmacist by day, historian by night.
Hey, I'm doing this podcast on the weekend. So.
And, he went and dug into religious archives on my behalf and got more information. Yeah,
again, when names change, or names turn out to have been nicknames almost 100 years ago, it's tough to figure out.
Exactly. Yeah. And when borders change, and, so many things change.
And to me, that's one of the most... I guess, I don't always say revelatory. One of the most interesting aspects of the book itself is just all of these places become something else, become somewhere else.
Yeah.
Everything is redrawn and rewritten, and all those borders we understand to be utterly arbitrary, and yet they become different people's homelands and the cause of nationalist uprisings of one stripe or another for more than a century.
Yeah. But I mean, it's also remarkable how people carry memory, especially in other parts of the world. You know, when I was finally able to piece together where my grandfather's birth village was and go back there and interview, you know, the about 10 elderly descendants of the Balkan Muslims who were given the homes of the Armenians after they were deported, they retained a lot because my grandfather's birth village was one side of this high basin that was surrounded by mountains and kind of invisible from the outside. So on one end of this basin, like a sort of football field shape, high basin, there was an Armenian village, and at the other end there was a Muslim village. So this Muslim village, which was called Harmankoy in my grandfather's day, that had remained populated, and the people who still have homes there are descendants of the people who lived there around the time that my grandfather lived there. They had memories that were passed down to them, and the Balkan Muslim descendants who lived in my grandfather's birth village, today called Muratja, they had heard stories from their parents and their grandparents, and it's a completely different way of life. There isn't internet there. There isn't, there are no shopping centers. I mean, it's a completely rural village in the northwestern part of Turkey that in part has maintained its sense of self because it's so geologically and geographically isolated. So, I saw what kind of fruit trees they had. I saw what kind of wild plants were there. And I was able to interview them. And they still today call it the Armenian village. It's this sort of ruin or remnant of a village that once had 3,000 Armenians living there from generation to generation, farming, producing crafts, going out into the world, coming back, having children, being recorded in Ottoman tax registers, giving birth to children, burying, loved ones there. So the memories remain there, even though the people who are there are not the descendant, not my family's descendants, but they're the descendants of the people who replaced them. But because the identity of that village was so distinct, these people who were very lovely, elderly farmers retained memories from before their own time, which I found very poignant, actually.
And I think throughout the book, you deal with people even-handedly. Like there's no dastardly evil side. I mean, yes, there's genocide. There's the fight, the war between the Jews and the Muslims in Palestine. You don't seem to come off as picking sides or villainizing people too much. There's maybe a sense that, having gone through this experience yourselves, it's not as cut and dry, I guess, to characterize one side or the other. Well,
I think if there's something that I would look askance upon, it would be nationalism, probably, because, nationalism can mow down a lot of people in its wake. These episodes of history, I don't think that the Ottoman Empire is what, how it's often painted. It was like, oh, it was a wonderful multicultural place where people lived in peace and harmony. I don't think that was actually true. I think if you take the magnifying lens and go down to the level of people living in villages, there was strife between them. There were language issues. There was, jealousies, competition, all the human foibles were there. But I saw how my own family, was just displaced, dispossessed, time after time after time. And so were other people.
Yeah.
Armenians suffered enormously. The Young Turk regime caused like immense mass violence, sexual violence, theft of properties. I mean, it's a just huge historical trauma, and it's a trauma that, I mean, I'm pleased that, you know, the U.S. Congress finally recognized it last year. You know, it's an indisputable historical fact, as much as, you know, some modern governments would care to dispute that. In every archive I visited, you know, in England, in France, in the United States, if you scratch the surface of the archive, the stories will come out, you know, narratives, both first-person narratives of Armenians who were forced to leave their villages and towns, who lost property, who lost every living member of their family, and also the official records. I mean, you know, I found the record of my grandfather's second deportation in the Ottoman archives, in the British National Archives. I mean, there's just account after account after account of people noting what is going on, this, you know, mass ethnic cleansing. So,
and that's why that final chapter where you make the decision to go back, or go there. I had to go to Frankfurt on business. Mm-hmm. I've gone a few times now, but that first time was tough. Now, my family's Ukrainian and Polish Jews, so not directly, not in Germany, but yeah, it was.
What was it like for you?
It was difficult. I had some good conversations with a couple of German business people I work with who kind of talked about at least I don't know how the Armenian genocide is treated by Turkish populace, but for the Germans, the description was essentially a pendulum every generation. Either we're hyper aware of what we did, what our ancestors did, or parents, grandparents, and are trying to make amends, or you swing another 20, 25 years, and it's, why should I be so burdened by all of these things? And the next generation swings back and back and forth.
Well, it's shocking how many Americans don't know anything about the Holocaust.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I'm.
It's shocking how many Americans not only don't know anything about the Holocaust, but don't believe that it happened.
There's that part of it too. Yeah. It's, it made Frankfurt, I could say, difficult the first time, but the conversations, and even going out to Nuremberg on my second trip and seeing some of that, I realized, okay, they're addressing it. Basically, a writer who both of his parents were Auschwitz survivors told me, he's like, it's not Germany. It's places where they pretend it didn't happen. Like you go to Poland and they try and say, no, the Jews, there were never any Jews here. That's where, you know, this guy was much more hung up and pissed off. He's like, at least the Germans admitted everything and have wrestled with it for 70 years. I have no idea if there's anything remotely like that with Turkey, or if it's still just a denial of everything.
It's. I mean, we all thought that we were getting slightly closer to it in 2014, 2015, but now we're right back to, you know, it's a nationalist thing. You have to create these myths that, you know. Exactly. And, you know, I mean, not to bring up the subject of the United States, but, you know, we too owe ourselves a much more honest accounting of what happened to, you know, the Native American, First American population. I mean, that was genocide. We owe ourselves a much more honest accounting of the legacy of slavery, the way it was integrated into the creation of the American economy, the creation of, you know, every structure in the United States, and not because it's Black history, but because it's American history.
Yeah. Well, I've said there's two rotten pillars that this country was built on: it's genocide and human slavery. But you find a significant chunk of the population that, no, Jesus said it was okay. You know, that's
right.
You know, a way of whitewashing everything that goes on here. So to speak,
yeah.
And every country, it was like when Turkey wanted to join the EU, and it was, well, they have issues with their ethnic minorities and the Kurds, and how dare we let them in? I'm like, really? You're going to look at every other EU country and look at the French with Algeria, the British with Northern Ireland?
Yeah.
Everybody's got a history that they were trying to either cover over or reconcile.
This is true, and I have always felt that probably the most I can do is attempt to educate myself And the other thing that I could do was to write the story of a single person who was kind of buffeted by, the winds of these movements, and yet managed to retain an integrity, an artistic vision, and to be completely uprooted and to completely replant his art in Jerusalem.
He did a fantastic job. And you didn't mention family, which is the other major driver for everything. There's the art, but there's the love of his family.
Yes.
It carries it the whole way. Sato, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. It was a great pleasure.
And that was Sato Moughalian. Her amazing new book is Feast of Ashes, The Life and Art of David Ohanessian, from Stanford University Press's Redwood Press imprint. It's a beautiful piece of work. I can't recommend it highly enough. I hope you got out of our conversation how much I dug it and how into it I really got. I even bought a copy for my mom last week for her birthday. Now, you can find Sato's site at satomoughalian.com, which is spelled exactly like it sounds. I'm just kidding. It is SATOMOUGHALIAN.com. It is the same as the spelling on this episode, all one word. She's also on Twitter as Sato Moughalian, also all one word. I hope the pandemic subsides in the U.S. for a lot of reasons, but one of them is so that I can see Sato perform and maybe attend one of her Feast of Ashes lectures. Now, after we wrapped, I asked Sato, so, who you been reading? And if you want to hear her answer to that, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. I finally posted the fourth quarter 2019 episode, which I eventually realized was partly because of work, pandemic, etc., but also partly because it's the quarter in which my best friend died, and I was really kind of hung up on that. So, anyway, supporters can listen to more than an hour of book recommendations and fun conversation with Chris Ware, Witold Rybczynski, Kate LaCour, Liz Hand, Frank Santoro, Ho-Che Anderson, Kevin Huizenga, Stephen Heller, Pete Bagg, Ed Ward, Annie Koyama, Rob Armstrong, Edie Nadelhaft, and Peter Cooper. You can support the Virtual Memories Show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, my zine, Haiku for Business Travelers, which I have to get around to writing now that I have all this time on my hands, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, I recorded this episode at Sato's home in New York City. I managed to find street parking a few blocks away, so that was fine. It was part of a 2-podcast day, so I had the toll at the GW, the Battery Park Tunnel, but I also had street parking for the other one, so that was it. If you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories Show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, and coffee, or just toss me some money because you think this show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. A special thanks go out to Jamie Anderson, Nick Bartosik, Buzz Carter, Michael Hacker, Fred Kish, Annie Koyama, Jonathan Kranz, Kevin Katila, Jack Lescamella, Edie Nadelhaft, Stephen Nadler, Barbara Nessim, Jim Ottaviani, George Fow, Payne Prophet, Dmitry Samarov, David Small, Stephen Solomon, Greg Tanner, Ford Thomas, Armando Veve, and Garrett Zecker for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories Show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.